just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Debato. Today, I've got two very special guests who have been on the No Delusion Zone before, and I'm very, very glad to have them back. It's Jonathan Sweet and Mark Toth. Jonathan Sweet is a retired U.S. Army colonel who served in the military intelligence branch for over 30 years. And one of his assignments was leading the European Command Intelligence Engagement and Vision from 2012 to 2014. Along with his partner Mark, he writes in a number of publications all over the world, and is appearing on podcasts and media platforms constantly. His partner in crime, Mark Toth, is an entrepreneur and businessman who, as a journalist, has written almost exclusively about military, national security, and intelligence affairs. Between the two of them, they've written for international publications such as the Kyiv Post, the Washington Post, the New York Post, the Hill, and many, many others. In fact, I think we're going to talk about a couple of their recent publications, their recent pieces in the New York Post and the Hill. So without further ado, I would like to welcome back Jonathan Sweet and Mark Toth. Welcome back, gentlemen.
David, thanks for having us back. Appreciate the opportunity.
David,
Sure.
thank you. Thank you for the intro. We've written for the New York Post, though, not the Washington Post.
I thought I'd get that in there. You wouldn't catch it. Okay.
There you go.
No, I knew you actually haven't, but I thought I'd give you a little liberal, conservative bent going on there, just in case anybody's keeping score. But thank you very much.
You've been on CNN, so that's liberal.
Ah, you have? Okay. Well, I'll just let you know I don't know, maybe make you feel better. I have canceled my subscription to the Washington Post, so for whatever that's worth.
Got it.
So anyway, yeah, let's jump right in. I mean, obviously, there's a lot going on. In 5 days, we've got a new president, a new old president coming back again, when Donald Trump is inaugurated on January 20th, next Monday at 12 noon. And there's a lot of anticipation on both sides of the aisle, all over America, all over the world, really, as to what to expect. What is President Trump going to do in his second administration in terms of a wide range of agendas? But we're going to focus on national security, international affairs for the most part. I'll throw this out to either one of you gentlemen. After or on noon of the 20th, this Monday, do either one of you anticipate any of Donald Trump's promises coming true, such as ending the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, solving the conflict in the Middle East, or any number of different campaign promises that he's made? Do you see any dramatic events happening within the first 24 hours?
I'll start off and then I'll let Mark chime in. Look, I think some of the campaign promises that he made, obviously, about getting the war in Ukraine, that's not going to happen on the first day. It's probably not going to happen in the first several weeks. Now, discussions may take place, but there's not going to be an end. There's not going to be an end to what's going on in the Middle East with Iran and Israel. The one red line that I'm most interested in is a red line involving the release of hostages, in which the president-elect has said that if they're not released by the 20th, all hell will break loose. So that to me is probably the first red line. And I suspect Hamas is very conscious of that because he has taken a direct approach to these type of problems with Iran and Soleimani, and then also with Syria in 2017 for utilizing chemical munitions. So I think Hamas, and we're seeing that today, that in serious discussions about a ceasefire and hostage release, but it has not been finalized. So Mark, what do you think about that?
Yeah, John, I'll start in a couple of areas. One, for viewers that may not be familiar with John and my work, we're apolitical. We're not here to champion Trump. We're not here to trash the Biden administration. We just try to call it straight as we see it. So in no way are any of my comments to come here basically being in support or against Trump. It's just a straight shooting approach. I think it's important when it comes to Trump, at least my analysis of the guy, is not to get caught up in his hyperbole that he's said on the campaign trail, but really look to the messaging behind it. And in terms of him basically saying, look, I'm going to solve things on day one, I'm going to bring an end to the war in 24 hours, all of that kind of stuff, that's just hyperbole. I think if you dig down to the messaging, he's basically saying he's going to make that a priority. He's going to create an end state at some point to it. Now, I think we all know, and we have known, that those are big, heavy lifts. They're not going to happen in 24 hours. It's going to take a lot to happen. Now, there are things that he can do by introducing this concept of maximum pressure that he first did in the Mideast during his first term. By applying that globally, he definitely can start to set those conditions. And we're right on the cusp. There's word out as we do this program with you that a ceasefire has actually been achieved with Hamas. But time will tell. The first set of hostages are not set to be released for 3 days from the time that we're having this discussion. So we'll see. But in my estimation, no, he's not going to achieve any of these things overnight. But I think what we are going to see is what his priorities are. And many of them, frankly, are good ones and are a good departure from where the Biden administration, especially Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken, were taking the country. A much needed approach to getting out of this defending into perpetuity and starting to win these conflicts.
Well, we were talking just before we went on air, Jonathan and I, very briefly about the fact that this is very Reagan-esque. The fact that this is exactly what happened on the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. I was actually on active duty at the time, and I remember vividly watching all of that, and it was an incredible inflection point in history where he said the same thing, and exactly the same thing happened with the Iran hostages, and they were released. So let's see if history can repeat itself. That would be an incredible achievement for anyone if that in fact happens. So let's keep our fingers crossed about that. Let me ask you, gentlemen, this, and this is more of a, I guess, an internal American issue rather than international, but certainly national security. If some of these, the campaign rhetoric, such as solving the war in 24 hours, having the Hamas release the hostages the same day, or else in similar type of campaign rhetoric, doesn't happen, does that weaken his position at all with certainly with his supporters and possibly even with some of the not his allies so much, but people who actually do believe the words and the rhetoric that he says? Would there be any negative or downside to that if it doesn't happen?
Well, I think we have to define what doesn't happen means. I mean, it doesn't happen within the first 24 hours.
Sure.
Doesn't happen within his administration, within the first year or two. So time, I think, is the first thing. Condition setting is what he needs to have. And he can't set conditions as the president-elect. Okay, he can talk, he can make comments, he can direct his incoming administration on where he wants to go, but he doesn't have the playbook. He doesn't have, as you and I understand, the intelligence that supports what he wants. He can't see, as Pete Hegseth said yesterday, he can't see under the hood. Okay, he'll get that hood and he'll get it within the next 5 days. But if he cannot come through in certain areas in a respectable time frame, I think then his administration will be judged. However, again, we already have seen Hamas leaning in towards a ceasefire and hostage release. I think if we start seeing that, and we see that as coming to fruition, we may start to see other countries that are involved in the process look at Trump and think that this guy might actually mean what he says, and we're going to start knocking down the walls of the permissive environment that the Biden administration has spent the last 4 years building up. And I think that's key. And we wrote an article about this in the Hill that comes out here Thursday morning. But I believe what you're going to see is that permissive environment is going to start getting chipped away. And you're going to start seeing America winning, as Trump has said before. And you can see as more of a leadership role as opposed to sitting back and criticizing role. So, Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think the bar is going to be whether or not he lives up to the campaign rhetoric. I think really that bar is going to be defined by where he plants his flags. Now, if it's a return to 2016 and he gets caught up in crowd sizes and those first couple of days of administration gets into that, kind of weeds, then yeah, he may see some diminishment of support. But I think if he comes out strong, and again, I don't say this as a champion of Trump, but as someone who's just solely concerned about the national security messaging, If he does, then he's going to plant that messaging quick, because there's still some people on the fence. Just again, as we go to tape this, you've got certain lawmakers in England trying to transfer Diego Garcia to another country, which is obviously a strategic air base for U.S. assets that John, having served in that region, is all too familiar with. And so those are the kind of things that if he dithers, if he gets caught up in too much of this crowd size type mentality, he's going to have a problem. I get the sense, though, that this time is different. When you look at his picks, he's not picking so much DC insiders as he is picking people that are going to advance his agenda as he sees it. So I suspect, but we won't know, we're all going to have to watch together, that you'll see probably a more coherent rollout of his overall foreign policy. And certainly, with the caveat that Trump is always going to step into it one way or the other as we go forward. But I think as long as he plants the flags, he'll buy himself a honeymoon period in that regard.
I want to circle back to Ukraine, which we have to, but I want to stay with the Middle East for a few minutes. Let's say that he does, or he is successful in getting the hostages released, whether it's the afternoon of the 20th or, as you said, within a reasonable amount of time, would be a huge win for the incoming administration. How would you gentlemen like to see the Trump administration pursue America's policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, vis-a-vis Israel, Iran? Where should we be? Because as you said, Biden dropped the ball, not just with the Middle East, but let's stay there. What would you like to see with the new administration and a new attitude towards specifically the Middle East, Israel, and its neighbors?
I think we need to refocus on the relationship we have with Israel. I think to some degree, the Biden administration weakened that relationship and in the way in which they treated Israel. One, by criticizing the methods that they were using to go after Hamas, to go after Hezbollah, by withholding weapon systems, by telling them that they would not support strikes into Iran. I think we have to move beyond that and get behind our Israeli allies. Peace in the Middle East is only going to be brought when Iran is held in check. Okay, and right now Iran is not in check. The Biden administration provided ransom dollars in the form of $6 billion. They lifted sanction waivers that put more money into the coffers of Iran. They were bent on trying to renegotiate nuclear treaties with Iran that were favorable towards Iran in the production of nuclear grade components. We got to put Iran in check, because with all that money, Iran's able to fund, train, and equip their proxies. Now, Hezbollah and Hamas are the two proxies that were the most useful to them, but they have been significantly degraded. Iran's turned to the Houthi right now to continue those type of deep strikes into Israel. But Israel has countered those often, and we need to be more supportive of countering the Houthi threat. But the real threat to the Middle East is Iran, and the bigger threat to Iran is the possible development of a nuclear weapon that could completely put that whole Middle East area into an arms race that we haven't seen lately. So, Mark, your 2 cents, since you grew up a bit in Israel.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's a lot of bilateral repair work that needs to be done in Israel. But let me zoom out a bit to the region and take people back in time to October 7th. When you look at that, a huge impetus behind October 7th was not just Hamas, but you had Israel and Saudi Arabia rapidly approaching normalization, and Iran was fearful of that equation happening. And so October 7th was just as much about disrupting that normalization process. We had teams, if people recollect, that were on their way to Riyadh to discuss how to make this happen, how to make it, public, what steps it was going to look like, adding it in effect to the Abraham Accords that Trump had started to initiate. And it all blew up because of October 7th. And so Iran is it's the big elephant in the room that has to be solved if you're going to solve anything in the Mideast. Israel has gone a long way in doing that, in terms of pinning back Hamas, in terms of effectively destroying Hezbollah, to the point now that the Lebanese government itself is saying we're going to take control of our country again. That's a good thing. To seeing how destabilized Syria became and ultimately toppled, with the new groups which had been anti-Israel basically saying, please, hands off, we're not going to be a threat to you. The face of the Mideast has changed, but Iran remains a player, if nothing else, because of this looming nuclear breakout, if they're not already there. And I suspect they are in terms of being able to do it. Again, just breaking, we've not been able to confirm this, but there looks like there's been another attempt by Israel to use the supply chain to affect the destruction of Iranian centrifuges, much in the same manner that they use pagers to kill off Hezbollah's key command. Iran itself is accusing Israel of doing that, as different centrifuge facilities have had explosions inside of them. So unless you solve that nuclear equation, I think that's going to be difficult to see any lasting peace happen in the Middle East. And to that end, as part of his confirmation hearings that were happening today, Marco Rubio, who's tapped to be the Secretary of State, basically saying that we cannot let, under any circumstances, Iran get a nuclear weapon. So that's got to be priority number one for Trump. You solve a lot if you do that. And I think in denying them a nuclear weapon, you probably help cause that regime eventually to topple. I'd only add one other quick point here and really let John speak to this, because it's a point that he's made much more, made much earlier than I did in my own analysis, is you can't forget in the Mideast now the Russian factor either. They've been pushed back on their heels in terms of being denied their bases at Tartus on the coast, the naval base, and the Khamenei air base. They've been pushed out, which is supplying their, disrupting their supply chain, not only to the Mideast in terms of the Houthis, the Iranians, but also affecting their ability to resupply their paramilitary forces in the Sahel in Africa. But they've got to be taken care of, because if you leave that relationship intact, then Iran has an out, and that can't happen. And defeating, Russia means defeating, making sure that Ukraine wins. So they're all connected.
I would like to jump in if I could, even before you Jonathan. I agree, of course, with everything you just said, Mark. Iran's the key. I mean, everybody that knows anything about that knows that Iran is the key. It's been a very permissive atmosphere, as you have both said. That needs to end. With Russia really taking a body blow, with Assad being dethroned and losing their bases there. Why? And I'll throw this out to either one of you or both of you. Why can't or shouldn't the United States work with Israel and just take them out? I don't mean, destroy Iran, but take out their nuclear capability once and for all. Who's going to stop us? Certainly not Russia. And they would have in the past. China's not going to step in. Correct me if I'm wrong. Why don't we use this opportunity to do what should have been done a very long time ago?
Yeah, we've spoken a lot about that. And I think it's all about enabling Israel to do that. I mean, Israel doesn't have, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, the particular strength of bunker busting bombs to get to some of the nuclear facilities.
Yeah, just quickly, they need the 20,000-pound bombs.
Yeah.
They don't have that. They have more in the line of 5,000 pounds.
Yeah. So we need to get into the business of equipping and enabling Israel to go after these targets. The same way we need to be into the business of enabling and equipping Ukraine to go after Russian targets that pose a direct threat to Ukraine.
So it's really the same issue. We're just not giving them the tools, the weapons.
We have not given them the tools or the weapons. And I'm confident in some cases we're giving them the intelligence, or we're sharing the intelligence. Look, Israel has their intelligence architecture. Ukraine has a very capable intelligence architecture, as we have seen. But I think we do help both of them. But when it comes to the munitions and releasing the authorities, I think we have to be much more proactive. Under the Biden administration, it's all been about defend. Every word by every one of its officials has been, we need to help Ukraine defend itself. We need to help Israel defend itself. I got it. Defend yourself. But eventually, you have to attack. And I've said it on this show before. It's Patton's word. Attack, attack, and attack some more. And why I think we have been so hesitant to win. We've forgotten how to win. All we know how to do is ceasefires and negotiations and peacekeeping forces. Sometimes winning solves problems. Can you imagine if the Iranian regime collapsed, if the Russian regime collapsed, 2/3 of the axis of evil will have gone. Do you think China and North Korea would take that into consideration when they tried to take Taiwan or South Korea? I think they would, because they would see that the world can unite against evil and defeat them. So it's frustrating as we sit back and watch how we have not provided everything. When we say shoulder to shoulder, we mean in the defensive mode, not necessarily in the offensive mode. For some reason, we do not want to be playing offense. And I think that would change under Trump, or at least in the past, he has used offensive tactics to get what he said he was going to do. So, Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd only quickly add, I agree completely with John. I think what we've seen here, and we've said it before, I'm not sure if we said it on your show, but basically you've had the Biden administration operating as if the world order was acting as it was on the day before Putin invaded Ukraine. That world order got destroyed. It doesn't exist anymore. This idea that diplomacy is going to solve everything, when you don't have the major actors of the world, China, Russia, and US on the same page, you're not going to get there. And yet they keep marching like that. I've described it in the past, kind of like the Grinch Who Stole Christmas. The presents have been stolen, and yet the Who's are still in Whoville marching around the tree, oblivious to it. And that's really been the diplomatic approach, in my opinion, of Blinken and Jake Sullivan. The reality is, and John and I have called it this, is that we are in a third world war. It's not what Hollywood said it would be. It's not mushroom clouds, day after radioactive scenarios, but it is very much a war by 1,000 cuts. And that's something that's going to be key for Trump to recognize, is that that's what he's got to repair. This is what Biden's permissive environment has allowed to break out throughout the world. And John is right. I mean, the major pacing threat for the U.S. continues to be China. And we just wrote a piece about that because it's coming to the Western Hemisphere, wrote that for the New York Post. And if we don't wake up to that, we're going to find ourselves on the wrong end of that equation.
Well, Donald Trump was elected, among many other reasons, as a president who was not going to start any new wars. And what we're talking about, in my opinion, is not starting new wars. In fact, it would be stopping new wars before they start, in my opinion. I'm very much for a much more robust, muscular military and intelligence response to what's going on in the world with Russia and China. We've been, just as you say, too permissive, and it's gotten us to where we are today. But let me ask you two gentlemen this. Would a much more aggressive approach, a military approach, to do what has to be done, to be honest, in the Middle East with Iran and in Ukraine with Russia, would a very robust military response to actually finishing these two affairs get the response, the approval of the American people? Would not a sizable percentage say, wait a minute, Mr. President, you're doing exactly what you said you would not, which is getting us into another war, World War III, or something along those lines? Do you see the Americans supporting a substantial military response to both of those theaters?
Involving U.S. forces, I think you'd probably be about 50-50 if the U.S. forces were involved in a substantial response. As far as enabling and equipping and supporting a military response, I think they're much more supportive. Look, how many Americans have died in Ukraine? American forces, not American people, because American citizens have gone to fight in Ukraine and have died, or in Israel have gone to fight as American military. And the answer is none. Okay, we have not lost any national treasure in either Ukraine or Israel in the terms of service members. Okay, we have provided equipment, we have provided weapons, we have provided technology, we have provided everything to enable. Just as Mark and I have said, it's just enough. And the just enough strategy hasn't been enough to win. And that's where we are. We're at the point now of, if you just keep giving enough, right? If you just keep doing that, you're just going to keep prolonging this. It's just going to go on and on and on. So the decision is, do you continue going on like that? or do you outfit them with what they need so they can finish the job? There's no doubt in my mind that Israel can finish the job in Iran, and there's no doubt in my mind that Ukraine can finish the job with Russia if they had the ability to interdict forces before they came into the country, if they had the ability to take out ballistic missile sites, cruise missile sites, Tu-95 airfields, if they had the ability to knock out their ability to continue fighting, this war would be over. But they don't, because they have to kill 1,900 Russians every single day. Where are they coming from? They're in a similar area somewhere. Why aren't we blowing that up and letting the guys in the trenches have a break? You know, go after the forces that haven't been committed to the fight. Same thing for Israel, I believe. I mean, Israel goes after those nuclear facilities and takes them out. That's the last straw that Iran has. Iran doesn't have a force projection military. The IRGC is capable, but they're not force projection. Their force projection was Hamas and Hezbollah. They don't have that anymore. They have to have a nuclear weapon in order to survive. You take out that capability, the Iranian regime collapses. It does. And there are people in waiting. Look, the Crown Prince wants to go back. I got it. And some Iranian citizens want him to come back. Is that the best solution? I don't know. It's a solution, and it's a better solution than we have right now. But defense doesn't work. Active defense helps, but eventually you got to take things out. And I think we're at the point where we have to start doing that. And that means we're going to have to ramp up our defense industry. I mean, we're already saying we don't have enough ATACMs. We don't have enough Bradleys. We don't have enough M1A1s. To start making some more.
Well,
Okay,
Jonathan and Mark, that's the point. I mean, I have to say this. I'm sorry to interject. I agree with what you're saying. And what we're talking about, I believe, is we need to give both Israel and Ukraine all of the tools that they need to win the war. But your point, we can't. We don't have enough right now because under the Biden administration, we didn't ramp up our military, our defense industry, civilian defense industry enough to provide that. Yes, we can give them a hell of a lot more than we have, but I don't believe at this point we have enough to send to both theaters to have them decisively defeat both Iran or the Iranian nuclear facilities and Russia. So what do we do in the meantime, or am I wrong?
Look, go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead. Let me try to set that up with 2 points. I think what's important, David, back to your first point that you asked John a few minutes ago about is it's not about starting a new war. We're in the war. I mean, 170 times, as John pointed out in the article that we just pinned for The Hill, U.S. troops have been attacked. How many times have U.S. carriers been under attack by the Houthis? We're under active kinetic attack, right? I mean, it's not about starting a war. It's about winning a war that's being perpetrated against us. And then it's also about recognizing that we cannot continue to have our national security strategies developed on a 2 to 4 year basis. They really need to match our foes who are thinking in 10, 20, 30-year cycles, especially China, Russia to a lesser extent. So that's the kind of mentality, in my opinion, that Trump needs to bring to this, looking at the near fight, the fight that's happening now and winning that, but also considering where we're headed towards, in the long run. So, from that standpoint, now I would differ, and I'm going to punt to John because I think he can answer this a little bit more expertly than me. I would argue that you can do both. Taking out Iran's nuclear facilities is a different beast than fighting a combined arms warfare type offensive in Ukraine. Those require a different suite of weapons. You can use air power to achieve a lot of what needs to be done in Iran in terms of taking out those systems. The U.S. could combine with that with its carrier forces and even land-based aircraft. That is something that can be accomplished, and Israel obviously has the capability itself to do that. So I'm not as concerned that you can't do both. I think you can. I think the bigger picture would be in terms of being concerned about, but again, it's a third kind of fight, is how we defend Taiwan. So there definitely needs to be this ramping up, but I think they each present their own kind of different type of battle. John?
No, I'll piggyback on that by saying we don't have to do it alone. And I think sometimes we keep thinking the U.S. has to do this. The U.S. is part of a 32-member nation called NATO. Okay, NATO will follow the United States. NATO has become limp-wristed because the United States has become limp-wristed, and they've simply fallen in behind the United States. Okay, Biden has put a lot of pressure on France and on Germany and on Great Britain not to release certain weapon systems to Ukraine for fear that they would use those in Russia. Okay, so I think by the U.S. taking the lead and coming in strong, those other countries are just waiting to come in. Okay, but they followed the U.S. lead, and once Biden steps aside and Trump steps in, I think we're going to see a more aggressive approach. This weekend, I think it was Waltz was on a couple of the Sunday talk shows and made reference to the possibility again of releasing those weapon systems to Ukraine to allow them to strike targets in Russia in order to bring Russia to the negotiation table. Look, they may come to the table, but Russia's not going to stop. We've seen multiple accounts over the past week, particularly one of the presidential aides to Putin come right out and say that, Ukraine's not going to exist. Moldova is going to cease to exist. We're going to go after the Baltic states. We need to listen to what these guys are saying because that's their intent. Their intent's the destruction of Ukraine, not a negotiation, not a ceasefire that's going to stop the war, but a ceasefire that allows them to build more combat power and come back at you again. And look, in the Middle East, who is going after the Houthi right now? Right now, it's Israel. And the United States has gone after them. Great Britain has gone after them too. Where are the Saudis? The Saudis and the United Arab Emirates fought the Houthis for upwards to 5 years. Why are they sitting back and watching? Why are we not leaning in on them for ground forces possibly to go into Yemen and put that to bed? Okay? Bombing countries doesn't win wars. It may affect wars and how things are thought out, but the only way you win a war is boots on the ground. And in order to upright, in this case, the Yemenis, it's going to take more than that. Okay, you're going to have to physically go in and do something. Why aren't we leaning on our Arab partners in that region of the world? Just saying.
I hear you. Look, if the United States, whether it's under President Trump or even if Biden had the guts to do it, just told NATO, look, we need to all band together and give Ukraine whatever the hell they need to defeat Russia, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now. I don't believe. Let me ask you this. There's been some reports recently where President-elect Trump is going to, or is considering going to meet with Putin, whether it's in Russia or somewhere else, and try to hammer out a peace agreement. Do you support him going in person to meet with Putin right now? And if he does, do you think that that is a smart thing to do, and whether anything would actually come of that?
I don't think it is. I think it legitimizes Putin. Okay, Putin's there's a warrant out for his arrest as a war criminal. Okay, how do you negotiate with a war criminal? Okay, how do you normalize relationships after a war with a war criminal that has killed tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians? How do you negotiate with that? How do you seriously legitimize that? How do you say that you can invade a country and take whatever you want? Because clearly Putin's response is going to be, I keep the Donbass, I keep Crimea, and they don't become part of NATO. Really? What's to negotiate? He's not going to come off those points. And do you think for a minute that Zelensky, who just said yesterday that the only security guarantee he'll accept is entrance into NATO? I mean, there's no start point. So for President Trump to go anywhere to have a discussion, I believe, with Putin is a complete waste of time. Okay, it's not going to come to anything that benefits him or Ukraine. Okay, I just don't see it. So Mark may have a different opinion, though. Mark.
No, I don't. I don't think there's any value of having Trump meet directly with Putin. I think all you do is elevate Putin back onto the world stage after 3 years almost of concerted effort to get him off of it. He's a war criminal. This is a man who's committing crimes against humanity. Having said that, though, I think it's exactly the kind of thing that Trump will probably do because he's going to think it's a mano to mano kind of thing. But I don't think it's going to be helpful in the long run. And I'd only add to that because we're seeing some hints of it. I think it's the wrong position to take that Ukraine needs to be conceding territory in this. You don't reward naked aggression by having, I'm sorry, I think I said Iran, I mean Ukraine. You don't reward naked aggression by having Ukraine give up sovereign territory, be that Crimea, be that in the Donbass or parts of, elsewhere. Just not a good idea. I don't think Ukraine's going to buy that. But again, Trump being Trump, I think we'll probably see this or at least an effort to have it come about.
Well, yeah, I mean, the art of the deal. He can negotiate with anyone, or he believes, even Putin, and he thinks that Putin, he understands Putin, which I don't think that's true. What we're talking about then is that the fact that, staying with Ukraine for just a moment, Russia needs to be defeated. The stalemate has to end. Short of an outright military defeat, though, some of the other options that have been discussed and are still being discussed is allowing Russian forces to stay in the occupied territories, not advance beyond them, and to put some kind of a peacekeeping force, whether it involves NATO or NATO, actually, and maybe not American forces, but NATO forces, to ensure that they don't go any further and to get Putin's guarantee that they would stay there. Of course, that's BS because Russia doesn't honor any agreements that they've ever agreed to. But that is one of the considerations that's been batted about for a very long time. Short of an out-and-out Russian military defeat, do you see that there's anything to that solution, allowing Russia to maintain, say, just the Donbass? Well, no, because he wouldn't do that. The Donbass and Crimea, and stationing NATO troops to ensure he doesn't go any further. Is that going to wash?
It won't wash with Zelensky, and it's certainly on the NATO troop side, or even if you don't call them NATO troops, even if they're bilateral troops that come over, French troops, Lithuanian troops, Russia doesn't want them there. Because if they're there, it impedes, I guess, what they want, which is the destruction of Ukraine. Russia's not going to allow international forces to be in Ukraine because that prevents them from achieving their ultimate objective. Okay, look. And I personally don't think Zelensky's ever going to concede the Donbass, and he's certainly not going to concede Crimea. I don't see that. I think that's wishful thinking. That's once upon a time, fairy tale, unicorn land, whatever analogy you want to use. It's just not going to happen. Look, Trump may want a conclusion to the war. Rubio may want a conclusion to the war. But the want has to come from Zelensky and it has to come from Putin, okay? And Trump can threaten to withhold support to Ukraine, then it's going to be upon Europe to step up. Because quite frankly, I think Eastern Europe is much more concerned about the possibility of Ukraine collapsing than Western Europe is. The Baltic states are. Poland certainly is. Poland's spending 4% on its military, okay? Finland's concerned. I know Romania is concerned. So Trump has to do more to convince Putin. He's got to bring on board with Zelensky, and getting those three together. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think you're going to agree upon a start point. The start point is, where's the line going to be? Where is the DMZ? What's the right and what's the left? And you're not going to get Putin or Zelensky to ever agree on where that line is. And oh, by the way, Ukrainian occupied the Kursk Oblast. How's that work out? Does Ukraine just give that back? Why should they if Russia's not going to give back what they took? I mean, so it's bigger than that. It's going to be much more complicated than that. I think the only way this works out is just what you said. You have to defeat Russia in Ukraine. Okay, and that means defeating Russian forces in Russia before they get to Ukraine, starving out the forces that are currently in Ukraine so they can't get resupplied with equipment, with food, with fuel, with ammo, with soldiers. Once you cut off that lifeline, there's nowhere for them to go. They'll have to leave, and let them leave under pressure. Let them leave under cluster munitions and 155. Okay, let them go. Okay, I think that's the only way it works. The war is interdiction and deep fighting right now. Ukraine is focused on the close fight, but they're fighting that deep fight. I mean, there's been reports the last couple of days of missiles hitting as far out as 150 kilometers, 1,800 kilometers, striking oil facilities, airfields, critical infrastructure. Ukraine's capable of doing it, but what's missing is the interdiction. The close fight and the deep fight, but the interdiction fight is what I think is missing and what's going to win the war. That's what's going to drive Putin to the negotiation table, his inability to sustain his combat forces in Ukraine. Mark?
Yeah, I would just quickly add that I think, why negotiate against ourselves? I mean, come January 20th, Trump effectively holds the winning hand. I mean, John and I today were going over some video of North Korean troops just charging across a field full of snow, just to get mowed down. They're going back and forth like a bad game that you might see on your phone as you're scrolling through. It's World War I. It's just, it's madness. I mean, they're telling you this is all we have. This is the kind of combat power that we can generate. World War I type, suicide runs across fields. It's crazy. There's no reason to give this. Russia's economy is on its back heels. I'm not saying it's going to fall because dictatorships are really good about keeping control of their country. But the economy itself is imploding. I mean, when you look at every which way, Trump has got aces in the hole that Biden has had too, but has been unwilling to play. So, in my opinion, if he goes and he meets with Putin, I'd rather him say, look, I've got you. I've got you in every which way. And these are the reasons why you can't win. And you know what? I'm not going to help you save face. We're just going to put an end to this. Do maximum pressure. I mean, if he believes in that concept, there's a perfect opportunity to do this. And I think Putin, I'm not sure that he's going to give up. But when faced with that, he may suddenly get reality that there is no out here. Because look, he's putting on a brave face now. He's had Biden who's been willing to play this game. His nuclear bluffing has worked. He's bought himself the most critical asset that he's had to date, which hasn't been his military, but has been time. And he's been hopeful that Trump's going to give him an out. If Trump takes that out away from him, then Putin may be forced to see the light.
Hey, and David, one of the things that Mark and I have written on several times, you remember the game, I think it was in the early 80s called Jenga, right? The Jenga tower.
Mm-hmm.
It's look, we're one or two pieces away from that tower collapsing. Okay, it's just we got to find the right piece, and sanctions ain't the right piece. Okay, it's going to have to be, when you talk about instruments of national power, diplomacy hasn't worked. Sanctions is working, but it's not the finishing blow. Okay, it's just not. Okay, we don't own the information realm. Russia does. Okay, the only other realm that we can maneuver in is the military realm. Okay, we need to get the big M back into dying. Okay, and we need to go after them in a way that affects them. And Ukraine can do it. But there's one or two little Jenga pieces that are out there. You just got to tug on a little bit, and that tower is going to collapse. He is so close to collapsing, and we do not want to. We've forgotten how to finish. We've forgotten how to win. All we know how to do is compromise. Okay, and compromise just means we're going to revisit this 5 years from now, 10 years from now. We're not helping out future generations. We're encumbering them.
Well, let me play devil's advocate and say that I agree with both of you.
Okay.
I think that there's a good chance that Trump is going to want to meet with Putin for all kinds of different reasons. Let's say he does that, and let's say that Putin makes him a deal. He pulls a Trump on Trump and tries to make a deal, or does make a deal, where Trump gives him Ukraine and Putin gives him whatever he thinks is important, a quid pro quo that he believes Trump could live with. Obviously, this would be lucrative. Whatever it is, I'm not even going to speculate, but something that Trump could say, yeah, that I could live with that. That would be good for me or America or whatever. And then he said, and then because of that, he comes back and withdraws all aid for Ukraine. Devil's advocate. I could see that that's a possibility. I don't think it's going to happen, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility either.
Yeah, out of the realm. No, I think it's possible. I mean, it's not likely. But again, it's not a one-horse show here. It's not just the United States. There's 31 other countries in
But what
NATO.
would they do, John? What would NATO do if that, in fact, just humor me for a minute. If that scenario played out, what would NATO do you think?
If the United States pulled out, not pulled
Yeah,
out,
just said, well, we're
pulled out.
withdrawing all our support for Ukraine because we made a deal. Trump made a deal. He did what he said,
Yeah.
and it's part of that deal is that U.S. is withdrawing all military support from Ukraine.
Well, first, it's a bilateral deal. It's not a NATO deal, right?
Correct.
Trump has a vote, obviously a veto vote in NATO that can prevent NATO from doing what it in a sense would want to do, okay, which is continue to provide support. Okay. Let's also remember that Ukraine has 12 bilateral security agreements with 12 NATO countries. Okay. So on an individual basis, I don't think Poland sits back and watches. I don't think the Baltic states sit back and watch. Okay. I think what you're going to see would be a unification of certain states who have been under the tyranny of Russia, who have absolutely no desire to revisit that, would take their own action. Now, what that action is, I don't know. Is it providing more military support? Is it actually putting boots on the ground? I think it's boots on the ground, unless Kiev looked like it was going to fall. And I think the French president has already said if that happened, he would commit French troops. So there are a lot of contingencies that could occur that don't necessarily involve NATO as a whole, but rather on a bilateral basis based upon security agreements they have with NATO countries. But I don't think Trump pulls out primarily because he's a single vote, and it would only create a bigger catastrophe for the security of the United States and our national interests, particularly in Europe. And I just don't see that happening. And Trump, by the way, doesn't like losing. Okay,
no, he doesn't.
If like that happened, it would be a personal embarrassment to him. And I just don't see that happening. I don't
unless he got something that he felt is worth it.
Yeah, and what that is, I don't know. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I really don't see it going there, David. I mean, it's fair to ask the question.
Just devil's advocate.
If he did take that approach, it would make Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan look brilliant by comparison, because the damage that basically conceding Ukraine would do to the security of Europe would be immense, and ultimately to the security of the U.S. around the globe. Again, because again, this theme that John and I are trying hard to hit this year in 2025 is that you've got to think in 10 to 20-year cycles. Putin's designs, his machinations, if you will, on Ukraine didn't just start in 2022. These are things he was plotting in 2001. I mean, this is a long time in coming. He was establishing the footprint. He was making his moves toward this was something that was always going to happen one way or the other. He had hoped to do it internally by overthrowing the existing government, keeping control of it, but he didn't do that. So he had to do it overtly. And we're seeing the same thing happen, albeit by different means, more long-term means, more economic initially, but what China is doing in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, this whole thing, and John and I wrote about this in the New York Post, is this whole thing about Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada to some extent. I think people are getting caught up in the I gotcha question, as we wrote, and they're missing the intended messaging that the incoming administration is trying to make, which is, look, China, we see you. We get it that the Northern Sea Route is opening up. That's this 3,500-mile northern route that, because the Arctic is melting, now is navigable from the Bering Straits near Alaska all the way over to Murmansk, north of Russia. I mean, the northern part of Russia that's close to Norway. That's now navigable. Greenland's going to become key in that. I'm not supporting that we militarily take Greenland, but that's what's behind that. The same thing in Panama. You've got Chinese companies controlling port facilities on both sides of it. China has been General Laura Richardson, who just retired. She had been the Southcom commander under Biden for that region in South America, was warning that China was trying to establish an economic footprint that ultimately would take a military tone to it. By building facilities and the like, and they've been trying in Chile to establish support that would allow them then to control the Drake Passage, that key other passage, so that if you look at a map and you start to see the Arctic and you see the Panama Canal and you see the Drake Passage, you could conceivably, not today, think 10, 15, 20 years out, with China ultimately gaining a blue water navy, you could see where we could be in some deep trouble of just transiting our shipping, be it naval or maritime, from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa. So, I'm hopeful that Trump will look at this long term and recognize that this wasn't a fight that just started yesterday with Putin. It's a fight that began long ago. You can't concede it. It would be no art of the deal to do that. And he's basically going to be sending China a blueprint to say, oh, look, Putin got away with it. We're going to get away with it too.
Well, we have to end it here pretty soon, gentlemen, but I do want to wrap it up with one question. And we started with this and you've written about it. So I'd like you to just give us your thoughts on this. We're not good at long-term planning. We don't look too far ahead. We're pretty much, as you said, Mark, at the beginning, in 2 to 4 year segments. What would you, both of you, say that we should do, America specifically, for our own national security, that we are not doing in terms of projecting and looking ahead in the long term to protect against the long-term strategy that China is pursuing?
It begins with a national security strategy, David. Okay, and it's got to be updated and it's got to reflect what's currently going on. Okay, right now our national security strategy envisions a 1.5 war conflict. We're at 3.5, arguably 4 wars that could possibly go on at the same time. We're not prepared for that. We're not ramped up militarily, industrial. We're not prepared for that. It starts with a plan, and we don't have a plan. This government for the past 4 years has been reactionary, reacting to crisis after crisis after crisis on an individual basis without seeing the total picture. Everything is interconnected, as Marcus said earlier, and we act as though there's separate spots on the ground that operate independently from one another. It's all connected, and it has to be brought together with a national security strategy, which we think critically about what's going on right now, how we're going to mitigate that, and then how we're going to survive in an operational environment. And until we get to that point, and it's going to involve building an aircraft in flight, okay? Because you just can't stop what's going on right now and take a year off to write it. It's going to have to be writing it and doing it at the same time. But it begins with a plan. And right now, we don't have a plan. Mark, what do you think?
No, I agree. I realize we're almost out of time here, so I'll keep it brief. I mean, basically, we need to take a 3D approach to all of this that we've not taken. And somehow as a country, we've got to find a way to extend out the planning that we do. I know we call for it in 2-year cycles, basically, to do these national security strategies, but I think there needs to be built-in 6-month updates, if you will, to them to reflect the changing realities on the ground, because they are an immense undertaking. They don't come together easily. It takes a year, upwards of a year, for everyone to kind of get their voice heard. And today we've not even talked about space as another domain that you've got to be worried about. So, I mean, there's a lot baked into that, as well as procurement. What kind of systems are going to be fought? How does AI change the battlefield? We're seeing it change it heavily in Ukraine. How's that going to affect our fighting force? So there's a lot out there that we have to get a handle on, and you just can't do that in 2 to 4 year cycles. And I think it's going to take a lot of bipartisan effort to do that, and maybe it gets accomplished more in the House and Senate. We're basically saying we've got to have these long-term committees that stay focused on that, so that we don't let the politics of the moment overshadow the national security risks that are decades, potentially in the making. Or you get the 9/11s happening, the Pearl Harbors. You just get caught blind.
And we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. As always, I really, really appreciate your insights into what's going on right now, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East theater. Thank you very much. Jonathan Sweet, Mark Toth, you both take care, stay safe, and stay sane.